Greetings and peace, everyone. Today I have the honor and privilege of part one. Everything which shows us who how he became. So in part two, we will talk about Roswell deception, of World War II. This is one of the most fascinating books that I have ever read. It basically breaks the narrative that we have been taught in the school system to or Hirohito, and what we've been known about like the alien myth. So this has been a life-changing book for me, and the information in here is so powerful that it's suppressed by the powers that be, and we have to get this information out there. And I'm really thankful to Peter. Also, he's the author of the Montauk Project, which is another fascinating book that has changed my life and the way I view things. The White Bat, The Alchemy of Writing, and this basically is another book that takes you into those realms of imagination and how basically you have to tap to find that truth within yourself. This is another great book. Also, there are two books that I've been reading recently, which are Montauk Book of the Dead and Montauk Book of the Living. These are also fascinating works that Peter Moon just takes you into a whole nother world when you read these books and you learn about synchronicities, how things work. And again, it just leads us into this reality that there's more to this world than what we've been taught in terms of growing up in the school, family system. And again, I will put the links for these books in the description below. Roswell Deception and the Demystification of World War II. And with that, good morning to Peter, and thank you for being here.
Well, thank you very much. I couldn't really hear you talking. You were going in and out during the intro, so I hope everybody else heard you.
Yes.
And further, I hope that you and everyone else can hear me. So thank you. It's good to be with you this morning. And where would you like me to start?
Just the aspect of the Roswell and what happened with like the Roswell incident and why there's this alien myth that's being pushed about the Roswell situation.
Okay, I will address that. And first, I will begin by reading a blurb that I put in the front of the book, because this not only shows the intrigue surrounding the Roswell incident of July 5th, 1947, which is an incident of allegedly a UFO crashing that has achieved such prominence as the biggest conspiracy cover-up in the UFO genre, or perhaps government, period. Now, this also, what I'm going to read here also shows the level of what you would say avoidance of this subject. And when you open up the book, it has, this is what it says. Donald Trump Jr. conducted an interview with his father, President Donald Trump, and he asked him the following question in June of 2020. That's almost 2 years ago. He says to his father, he says, before you leave office, will you let us know if there's aliens? Because this is the only thing I really want to know. I want to know what's going on. Would you ever open up Roswell and let us know what's really going on there? And Donald Trump, the president, then says, there are millions and millions of people that want to go there, that want to see it. I won't talk to you about what I know about it, but it's very interesting, said President Trump. Roswell's a very interesting place with a lot of people that would like to know what's going on. Now, I put this quote in the beginning of the book, and one of the quotes I could not find, I did hear it on the television, but I couldn't find it to replicate it exactly, where Trump himself, I've been hearing some very interesting things about Roswell lately. And he's obviously referring to people who are feeding him information who have been listening to the podcast of my co-author, Douglas Dietrich, which tells the true story of Roswell. Now, I do not think Donald Trump is, I mean, he's known to exaggerate, but I don't think he's exaggerating at all when he says there are millions and millions of people who would want to go there, want to see it. And of course, these millions of people are common people and non-common people, but nevertheless, that is our audience. And we've probably sold, oh God, no more than 400 books since the book was released on July 4th of last year, 2021. Now the book is out there. It's advertised. In fact, my interview requests since that book came out, people wanting to interview me has stopped. And this is by your alternative media people that, like to interview me on my past stuff, which is also controversial, but it's been around so long, it's been sort of grandfathered into the genre of conspiracy and whatnot. The main theme of my work is time travel. However, this conspiracy around Roswell is so huge that people won't go there. Not even the conspiracy theorists won't talk about it. So so we will now discuss what happened on July 5th of 1947. And the beginning of the book says the Roswell Crash. This is the front blurb, the very first page before you get to the Donald Trump page. The Roswell Crash has had a massive hypnotic effect on the collective psyche of mankind ever since the U.S. Army issued a press release that a flying disc crashed in the New Mexican desert in July of 1947. Retracting their statement a day later, they have since orchestrated a massive psychological operation against the public to hide a long history of war crimes involving some of the most iconic of American heroes. At the core of this operation is the government's most guarded secret of World War II, the Japanese emperor's direct role in prosecuting the war. Now, what I have just said there is a mouthful. It's like everybody knows, you can read the papers and the headlines are included, and even some of the articles are quoted in the book, that in 1947, a flying disc crashed in New Mexico, near Roswell. So, wow, everybody's interesting. And then it's a panic. It's like the military withdraws the statement and says it was a crashed weather balloon, and it's just like, wow. It's like the government has pulled off the biggest conspiracy. A UFO landed and they're hiding it. If you watch the very lengthy series produced by Steven Spielberg, Taken, that came out in the 2000s, early 2000s, it set a whole conspiracy of abduction built around the theme of the Roswell crash. This is pure government Hollywood propaganda. So it's also a fact that Emperor Hirohito of Japan, the emperor of the Empire of Japan, has always been portrayed as a sort of benign, ignorant person who had nothing to do with a war machine. And that's why they allowed him to stay on as the emperor instead of, and the people who were tried for war crimes were actually enemies of his. And General MacArthur, who orchestrated the whole, what was called the occupation of Japan, he was serving the Japanese emperor's interests by executing the emperor's enemies, the Japanese enemies, and doing the emperor a service and a favor, all at the emperor's direction. And even the press who covered the trial said they were sham trials. They didn't understand why they were sham trials, but they were. So I'm going to go back a little bit now into the history of the emperor. When he was a young man, the emperor in waiting, he was horrified to read an article. It was actually a short story that appeared in Collier's magazine, which was translated into many languages, including Japanese. The emperor already, he was a member of the, well, I don't think he was then, but he would later become a member of the Royal Garter of England, and he spoke English. But he read this article on Collier's, which was a short story by heralded American Californian author Jack London. There's a whole building in Oakland, California, where he was from, called Jack London Tower. That's how famous this guy was. He was not a novelist, but he was also a newspaperman. And Jack London had studied, or had gone as a field reporter to cover the Russo-Japanese War back in the early 1900s. And he was put in I think a Japanese jail. I wouldn't call it a jail. It was like a military jail, probably. And, so he was horrified by his experiences, but he wrote a story about annihilating the entire Sinitic race. By Sinitic, we mean those who are Japanese or of that lineage or DNA. The Japanese are not Sinitic. They are their own race. They are both Asian. There are similarities, but they are distinctly different. And of course, there's mixtures between the two as well. But he wanted to wipe out the entire Sinitic race. It wasn't, if I recall properly, if it was the Japanese that put him in jail, this wasn't against the Japanese, it was against the Chinese. He might not have distinguished the two, but he wanted to wipe them out with biological warfare. And when Emperor Hirohito read this article, he was horrified because he said, if they're going to wipe out, and they were basically saying wipe out the yellow race. And the yellow race refers to either one. It initially referred to the Chinese, but it refers to both. It was a staple word. The yellow peril, they called it, which meant we don't want no more Asians here in America. So Emperor Hiro was so horrified in realizing that this rhetoric was going out to wipe out the entire Sinitic race. He says he better have an answer for it if he's going to become the emperor, and he needs to protect his empire. So he began a series of experiments with the yellow fever virus, and to bring it up, well, actually, he first had to acquire the yellow fever virus. And
okay, I found this on the web for his experiments with the yellow fever virus, and to bring it up while I'm actually...
Excuse me. I was trying to find something in my document, and somehow Alexa or the equivalent thereon came on. It was very irritating. I apologize for that. So anyway, we have Emperor Hirohito. He had to acquire a sample of the yellow fever virus. Let me see if I can find it here. I want to get the guy's exact name. There was a spy in America. His name was Hideo Noguchi, a bacteriologist who achieved great notoriety in both Japan and the United States. He was sponsored for 25 years by the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research in New York, where they had isolated over half a dozen diseases, including yellow fever. Although Noguchi's research was criticized, he was able to bring the yellow fever virus to Hirohito, who weaponized it and perfected it to such a degree that he could potentially exterminate millions. Now, his biggest challenge was to ratchet down this virus so that it would be not as deadly as it could have been. Because if you're going to use a bacteriological warfare, you want to direct it at a specific population or segment of a population, like an army unit or something. You don't necessarily want to be killing off whole civilizations. And that's what he was confronted with. Now, he used a model. This was a model from the Americans that created the so-called Spanish flu, which is more properly called the American Army and Navy flu. That had killed over 100 million people worldwide, probably closer to 300 million. And it was horrible. It's far excessive of what we have with COVID to this day in terms of the numbers. So it was worse than the Black Plague in terms of the number of people it killed.
That's fascinating, Peter. And, you know, all the information that you laid out gives us a generic overview and a full historical analysis of what we are not taught in history books, including what this book teaches us about basically Japan winning World War II. So if you can also expand on that also, on how Japan won World War II and what circumstances.
We'll get to this, but this is how he won it. And none of this data is known or recognized. There are whole books about the notorious Unit 731, a department of the Japanese Army that was dedicated to biological warfare. And while the books have been written upon that, it shows that the Japanese had all sorts of incredible biological weapons, but it doesn't go down this particular train of facts that I am relaying to you. Emperor Hirohito had to test these weapons. And the Americans knew well that he battle tested them in the fields of China. In the Battle of Hankow, there was a 4-month campaign where 230,000 Japanese defeated over 1 million Chinese. The only way they could beat those odds was the biocidal weapons. They were placed in porcelain shells that were launched by artillery and exploded upon the population. The spread was all the more effective because the Chinese all lived together in units of, villages and whatnot. There were like 10 miles within each other. People didn't go more than 10 miles away from their homes during their entire lives because of the way of the geography and all the hills and the rivers. So they were tested during the Chinese War, and he was able to, regulate the general effectiveness of them. But there's more history behind all of this. And to address your question of how this was used to win the war, well, because China is filled with so many rivers and valleys, and the only way you could negotiate China was by the rivers, you couldn't just take tanks in there or armies and shoot them on the population. So what they did was Emperor Hirohito studied the dirigible technology of the Germans and the Americans, both who had used it during World War I, and it ended up being a failure for both countries because, the Hindenburg sort of killed it for everybody. The famous crash of the Hindenburg, people went away from that. And of course, the American program was sabotaged by the Japanese. And the reason for it was like the Hindenburg they were using hydrogen in Germany. America had a monopoly on helium, which was much safer than the hydrogen. So when the German ship, the Hindenburg, exploded over New Jersey, it kind of killed their program. What killed the American program was different because they had a safer helium. But what had happened is the Spanish-American War, where the Americans had invaded the Philippines and basically took possession of it. They won it, or paid for it, actually, after the Spanish-American War by paying Spain some fantastic number of money for the time, but they became the owners of the Philippines. And the Philippines did not become independent till after the war. And it wasn't because they were being liberated from the Japanese who had invaded the Philippines. It was because they were being liberated from the Americans. The Japanese were liberators of the Philippines, in effect. So the Philippines hated the Americans. And one of the reasons for this, not the only reason, was that they had slaughtered some 3 million Muslims. Just killed them. They had horrible names for them. And they slaughtered them. This was not necessary. And this is not the only reason, but a great part of the reason Muslims do not like America. And I'm talking about not necessarily Muslims that are within America. Some of them do hate America because they're extractions from Muslim cultures who do hate America. Not all Muslims hate America by any stretch of the imagination, but there are definitely those who do. And one of the reasons for this is the slaughtering, the genocidal slaughtering of Muslims, 3 million around the turn of the century, when America acquired the Philippine Islands and other territorial possessions of the Spanish government because they had defeated Spain. So this was what happened with these dirigibles that the Americans had. They had also taken many of these Philippine people as slaves, just slaves. They went in the Navy, and the Navy used them as slaves. They'd bring them over here. They had no citizenship. They had no anything. They were literally slaves for the Navy. And what the Japanese would do is who were much more aligned with the Philippines than the Americans, they would use these Philippines to sabotage the craft because they served in a servant slave capacity aboard these dirigibles, and they would put bombs and they would sabotage them. And this is what killed the American program. Nevertheless, Hirohito studied the positives and negatives of both the Germans and the Americans in building these dirigibles, and he created what was called the super dirigible. And the super dirigibles were just incredible devices that had a huge balloon that was surrounded by about eight other balloons. So if one balloon went down and was attacked or was deflated, it would have so many other balloons, and these had an incredible lift capacity. They had small planes attached, not horribly small, but they were real planes that could do damage, they could set bombs, could shoot. And they had small tanks that they could lift down, like mini tanks. We got pictures of the mini tanks. And they had the potential for biological weapons as well. On some missions they were used and dropped from above, like say in China. They were never, these particular super dirigibles were designed so ultimately they could wipe out the entire United States. And they could have. The reason the United States was never wiped out as such was due to the foresight and intelligence and military genius of Emperor Hirohito. His game was not to conquer the United States. He never wanted to conquer the United States. The United States had invaded Japan in, I think it was 1853, it was the 1850s, by Commodore Matthew Perry. And the reason the Americans under Commodore Matthew Perry's, what would you call it, bastardized American flag, because it was not a true American flag that he flew. And I'll tell the reason for that in a second. Commodore Perry invaded the Japanese islands, the main island of Honshu. He brought his, warship there because the British had dominated China in order that they could sell every Chinese person, a pound of opium per month or whatever it was. The Chinese were obligated to buy so much opium. I'm talking about individual citizens. Like if you have to, it's like you having to go buy a COVID test, a booster shot once every year or once every month, and get a COVID test every month, and you had to pay a decent sum for it, maybe $100 or something. If you had to do that, this is what the Chinese had to do, only they had to buy opium. For what? The Japanese or the Americans wanted to get their share of the Orient, and they wanted Japan. But they weren't supposed to be there by treaties and whatnot. So Commodore Perry had this really squirrely, weird flag that he carried under orders. He was to wave a flag that had what looked like the stars and stripes on one side, although it was upside down, and it wasn't quite the same as the American flag. It was very similar. You wouldn't notice it just to look at it, but it was upside down, and on the other side was a white flag. So it was a banner with one side was white, and the other side was this bastardized American flag, so that if he was ever apprehended by the British, the French, or whoever, and they saw his flag, this was proof, in quotes, that he was not flying under the true American colors, and he was a pirate. And he would be declared as a pirate by the American State Department, and he would be disowned. But that was just to cover for what they, he really was operating on behalf of the government. He was a United States Navy Commodore, which means he was in charge of a flotilla of ships. And basically, he forced the Japanese at gunpoint to come into modern times. They were an isolated culture, and the whole history of their isolation goes back to August 15th of over 1,000 years earlier, when Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, tried to invade Japan. He had a huge superior force, tens of thousands of ships, something that the Japanese could not possibly overcome. And what he did, the emperor of that time, his name is in the book, I don't know it, I can't remember it, but he prayed to the Japanese god, and the Japanese god, according to legend, unleashed the kamikaze. The kamikaze means divine winds. And these winds literally did appear and blew Kublai Khan's ships out of the water, completely destroyed one of the largest naval fleets in history. And that's how come Japan was saved from the invasion of Kublai Khan's empire. And this occurred on August 15th. This was the holy, or, a day of liberation for the Japanese, August 15th. We'll get back to August 15th when we get into the American capitulation to the Japanese that occurred on August 15th, 1945, something you haven't heard about because it's not promoted or advertised. But that was the day that the Americans accepted the Japanese terms for peace in 1945 on August 15th. And maybe to make it a bit stronger.
That's absolutely fascinating, Peter.
On August 15th, there were arrangements and back channel negotiations to arrange for a face-saving. You ever heard the expression of Japanese or Chinese called saving face? You got to save face. The Japanese allowed the Americans to save face by having a ceremony of surrender on the USS Missouri in August of 1945, giving the impression that the Americans had facilitated an unconditional surrender by the Japanese. This was not true, because if it was a true surrender, they would have surrendered formally with Emperor Hirohito himself, surrendering their samurai swords, but they did nothing of the kind. What did transpire was a continuation of hostilities between the two nations that was only ended on the last day of 1946, when President Harry Truman acknowledged the end of hostilities in the Asian theater of war, because the hostilities already ended in Germany when Berlin fell. But in 1946, there was an end of hostilities with the Japanese. 1946, not 1945. That's a year and 3 months after the so-called Missouri signing. And the Russians signed the treaty on the Missouri, but the Russians continued to fight the Japanese. So what was the treaty good? It wasn't a treaty. There were still hostilities going on. The actual treaty between the United States, or I should say the Allies, which included the United States, because the United States were not fighting Japanese on their own. They were fighting under the Allied command. The United Nations was fighting the Japanese. And the United States was a member of the United Nations. And the Japanese not only brought the United Nations to their knees, as my co-author would say, and I can say it too, but forced them to capitulate to the desire of Japan. Because when Commodore Perry forced the Japanese into cooperating with the West, the Japanese were basically paralyzed as a culture, but they had to start becoming smarter and learn how to protect themselves from outside influence. And this history is what forced Emperor Hirohito to study biological weapons, because he knew that he could win with them, or this is how he could defend with them. He didn't know that he was going to win. And there were some pretty close calls within rebellious groups within Japan itself who were against the emperor that he succeeded in subduing. And that's why he had to execute certain people after the war. But on the USS Missouri, the Japanese insisted that Commodore Perry's flag be brought there and shown. And it's in the background. You'll see it. It's an upside down American flag. Why in the hell would you have an upside down American flag at a genuine peace treaty? And I will also tell you, growing up, when I did, in the wake of World War II, I was born in 1953. And one of the things that you would say in school is the Pledge of Allegiance every day. And you'd sing a song after the Pledge of Allegiance. It would be America the Beautiful, Star Spangled Banner, or My Country 'Tis of Thee. One of those three songs we would sing in grammar school, after every Pledge of Allegiance. The songs pandered out in the 5th and 6th, 7th and 8th grade, but you still did the pledge. And we also did air raid drills, where the sounds that go off, this is an air raid, we'd have fire drills and we'd have air raid drills. And the air raid drills, you go duck under your desk in case there were planes coming over, Japanese planes coming to bomb us. It was so apprehensive in the culture that of the 50s and at least the early 60s. And this the situation of being so, I guess what you'd say, afraid of the Jap. This is what we were, I guess, apprehensive about. And then everything you bought at the store, particularly kids' toys, but not exclusively, that said made in Japan, made in Japan. Because what created World War II was the Americans had cut off the Japanese oil supply. And the Japanese oil supply, they were going to starve. They were going to be held off, and they were going to become totally subject to the United States, just like China was to Great Britain. And when they became subject, they would have no culture left. They would or it would be invaded. And so they were forced to go to war with the Americans. But it really wasn't the Japanese that started the war. I'm tracking back to what happened, but this is what happened aboard the USS Missouri. And I'm going back and forth here, but just to finish that thread on the Missouri, is that the actual negotiations that lasted from 1945, August 15th, all the way up to 1951 in September, that was 6 years worth of negotiations. In September, they signed a peace treaty. Well, they signed the peace treaty at the Presidio in San Francisco, where my co-author Douglas Dietrich worked. And he dug up a lot of the information that's in this book there because he was assigned to burn it as a Defense Department research librarian. He was assigned to burn this information. Much of it. Some of it is just purely academic research that he's done as a Defense Department research librarian. You can corroborate most everything that's said in here, in the book. You can corroborate it. And that some things that you can say that you can't say exactly it's this way, you can see logically, because obviously we're dealing with a highly confidential documents about the back channel negotiations with the United States and the Emperor. And one of the reasons, well, the reason we know it is because Douglas's mother, Douglas is half Asian and half German, German-American, German. So by ethnicity, it would be German. And his mother spoke several languages, including English, and she was a translator for the diplomacy that went back between the United States and the Emperor. And she told him exactly what went on. So he's kind of in a position to know, independent of his Presidio functions, which totally complemented what he had learned from her. So in 1951, there was peace, official peace between the Empire of Japan and the Empire of Japan, after several years, was allowed to become a member of the United Nations and had a seat on the Security Council. So this is not something you do with your enemy. You don't take your enemy and they were basically at war with the United Nations. And the treaty went into effect on the Emperor's birthday, which would be here in America, April 28th. It was 1952. So the war was settled on August 15th, or the beginning, where the Americans agreed to Emperor Hirohito's peace terms. And the basic peace terms were that the emperor could stay on as emperor. And he offered this in January of 1945. The Americans refused. It was the Americans who refused, FDR in particular. Once FDR died in April of 1945, 45, they were able to conduct, the Americans were able to conduct negotiations with the Germans and with the Japanese, and that eventually led to the capitulation of the United Nations. Of course, Germany was a different case, and Germany was actually defeated militarily, whereas Japan was not. And Japan had, well, I'm going to go back into the history, track back now into the history of the war, as is rendered in the book. Now, it was in the 1938 that the Japanese, who had been fighting with the Chinese, were conducting peace negotiations. And these peace negotiations were going on in Nanjing, which was then the capital of China. We all know, I don't know if you say it Nanjing or Nanking.
Nanjing.
Nanjing, yeah. The 1937. Okay, it was 19. I said 1938. It was 1937. What had happened there? There was negotiations going on between the Japanese and the Japanese. Peaceful negotiations. They were trying to work out peace. And the American, and there's a whole story behind these Americans who did this. They were the this is a very sinister. This is the, I guess what you call the apex of a whole series of sinister operations by the Americans that was taking place, being directed by a communist who was working for FDR, his top economic advisor. And this guy was a real son of a bitch. I can't even remember, God, why can't I remember his name? It used to be on the tip of my tongue.
And you know, that was fascinating, Peter, what had happened when the Japanese and Chinese were in that peace negotiation, and you had these people that were dressed up to attack the Japanese as Orientals, thinking
I'm getting with this, but they were put up to it by Lachlan Curry. His name is Lachlan Curry, Lauchlin Curry. You can read all about him. He was Roosevelt's White House economic advisor, a Canadian citizen, and a Marxist economist from Harvard who was associated with other Marxists. He drafted new laws, which became the laws of the Federal Reserve. And the new laws of the Federal Reserve, he completely captivated and manipulated Roosevelt, and even used to brag about it in his dispatches to Stalin, who he was in cahoots with. He was eventually exposed by the FBI as a spy. And this is all documented. And when it got to Roosevelt, he just kind of overlooked it all and sent him off to, eventually he ended up in Colombia. But FDR, everybody hated him. But FDR just looked the other way because he was his top guy. This is how treasonous FDR was, and we can go down a rabbit hole with that as well. But the people that invaded, what happened is the Americans had a plan, and they dressed up as Chinese coolies. They went in and shot up the Japanese operations there, attacked the peace negotiations, and the Japanese, seeing these guys dressed as Chinese, thought they were Chinese. So this became a massive attack on Nanjing, which is called the Rape of Nanjing. And the Japanese leveled this capital city, and they looked like tremendous bad guys. They were motivated because the Chinese were attacking them while they were trying to make peace. In other words, the Chinese were showing no quarter to them. After they took Chinese captive and interrogated them, they figured out very quickly that it wasn't the Chinese that did it. It was the white people. And they didn't know whether it was the British or the Americans, nor did the Chinese, just that it wasn't them and they were white people. So then in 1937, they bombed the Lady Bird, a British ship, I think it was in Singapore, and they bombed the Panay, an American ship. And this began World War II in 1937. The papers referred to it as the war. When soldiers would come back, how's the war going on? There was a war between between the Americans and the Japanese at that time. This was all way prior to Pearl Harbor. But there was a fight going on militarily. FDR needed to declare war. The Japanese were planning to attack Pearl Harbor. He knew it. He let them do it. And when he did, it was an overwhelming victory in that battle for the Japanese. What happened in December of 1947, and that gave FDR enough ammunition to convince everybody to declare war, the Congress, and to get the American public behind it. Although Americans really didn't understand what was going on. Why the hell were the Japanese bombing us? The only reason they had to bomb in the first place was because they were being strangled economically. The Japanese had no choice. They were being put into a corner. So there was a lot of anti-Roosevelt sentiment in the United States, and there was an attempt to, overthrow FDR. And we'll go into that in the book. But one of the favorite units of the military to FDR was the Marine Corps. And they were also ardently communist. They were completely communist. And, this is all covered in the book. And so it was Lachlan Murray who arranged for these Marine communists to go in and attack the Japanese and shoot up the peace treaty. But after Pearl Harbor, February 1942, 6-7 weeks after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese emperor unleashes his dirigibles. They go up what is called the Kuroshio Current. And I didn't mention this. Emperor Hirohito was a marine biologist. He was a PhD. He was renowned throughout the world because he had discovered a species, which in those days made your career as a marine biologist. This is how he learned how to ratchet down yellow fever, how to ratchet it up and ratchet it down. So he had a whole history of studying marine biology, and he studied the currents of the oceans. And there is the Kuroshio Current, sometimes called the Japanese Current, which goes up Japan, goes up next to Kamchatka, over south of Alaska, and comes down. This is all over the ocean, comes down the Pacific, North American continent, down Canada, down by Seattle, and all the way down to San Francisco, and down into the Los Angeles area. It also goes south of Los Angeles into the Southern Pacific and goes back towards Japan, so you could actually take a dirigible and you can fly it over in about 3 days. That's faster than you're going to get on a steamer crossing the Pacific Ocean. You just go up that current and come down, and you can eventually get back to Japan with the same current on its southerly route. So the Japanese had these super dirigibles, and there's pictures of them. They're illustrations because the actual photographs Douglas could not take out of the Presidio. He made meticulous pictures of everything, and he has a thorough knowledge of how they operated from what he studied at the Presidio. Anyway, you could bring these ships were brought down, and they hovered over the city of Los Angeles. And February 24th, 25th, 1942. And they unleashed planes. The Americans suspected he was going to unleash biological weapons because they knew what he was doing in China. And they brought out their guns, they panicked, and there's newspaper articles about the battle. Well, they didn't call it the Battle of Los Angeles, but this is what it's been known as. So they were was massive panic, and Hirohito was just trying to frighten the American military into believing they were going to infect the population. So you have massive artillery fire. Some of the Japanese planes went down. But what was more astounding was that the Secretary of the Navy and the military itself began to truncate the reports of a Japanese attack. They did not want the American population knowing that the Japanese were attacking them. The Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, announced publicly that the American response, which was a huge panic, was a case of war nerves. Now, this is ridiculous. He says there was no attack having taken place, nor foreign or otherwise unidentified aircraft having been present. It was just war nerves that caused the military to panic. Now, the Americans went on to create an instant vaccine to protect their troops from biological weapons that they thought the emperor was unleashing upon the city of Los Angeles. He was not. This vaccine, which had no approval from the FDA or anybody else, and it takes 10 years to create a vaccine that works with all the trial and error. This is standard virology. It's not applied today because they know better today. But back then, it took 10 years to create one. It killed 50,000 of their troops almost immediately and infected another 350,000 of their own troops who had to be mustered out of the service because they were now unfit for combat. The superdirigibles were frightening the hell, and they were called UFOs and flying saucers. And now you have movies in modern times called the Battle of Los Angeles, which it's aliens and flying saucers.
That's exactly right. And that, Peter, that brings into my mind in terms of the Battle of Los Angeles and how there's this alien myth about what they found at Roswell, which were actually the Japanese.
Well, yeah, I'm going to get into this now. It's like the Japanese who manned these dirigibles were small in stature, usually not greater than 4 feet in height. And they were known as the Yakuza, whose tradition includes the severing of the pinky finger in order to atone for their sins. So you had 3-fingered Japanese midgets. And they were really small, really not midgets as what we would think of as a midget. They were just very small because Japanese eat a vegetarian diet, and meat was not introduced there seriously till after World War II. Japanese didn't eat pork. They eat fish, but other than that, it was all vegetarian. So they were smaller. Japanese have gotten bigger since with the meat diets. So you had these 3-fingered Japanese who would shave all of their body hair. And they looked like aliens because they shaved all their body hair because you don't want any sudden ignition. Any hair that's exposed is going to catch fire in certain where things, things were very volatile. So you had to really, and all of the controls were very small because, there was limited room there, and all these dirigibles were huge. They were operated by these tiny people. This sets the stage for them being recognized as aliens. But if you look at the newspaper reports, you will see that, people were saying the Americans, soldiers were told to tell the population it was aliens. It was aliens to the degree that the Japanese considered are foreigners or aliens. The implication was extraterrestrial, but it was not. The pictures were altered to make it look like there was a saucer involved with the Battle of Los Angeles. These pictures, newspaper pictures, are reproduced in the book. Now, the Battle of Los Angeles is the precursor for what happens with Roswell. And we have to, there's so much history I'm leaving out because we're only in a, relatively short podcast here. So I will move on. But basically, this sets the stage for what becomes the Roswell incident. Because there's also the myth surrounding the atom bomb, is that the atom bomb forced the complete capitulation of the Japanese. Now, when the atom bomb of Hiroshima was only obtained by the Americans, it was obtained from the Germans, because the Germans already had an atom bomb, and this is historically documented. Hitler did not want to use atomic weapons because he saw what it did to the DNA, and he didn't want the Aryan race being corrupted. So he unleashed an atomic bomb, or the Germans did. I think it was in Lithuania. This is in the book. And they did have an atom bomb. It was a uranium bomb. And when Roosevelt died, Truman then took Charles Lindbergh, a very pro-German, pro-Nazi sympathizer who was fighting in the Pacific, who Roosevelt hated, and he brought him from the Japanese theater or the Asian theater to negotiate with the Germans to secure this bomb. It was known as Little Boy. And Little Boy was brought over, and there's a whole weird story about it, but it actually did get to Hiroshima and was unleashed. I mean, that's undeniable. It was unleashed. But what happened was, when it was bombed, the Japanese military was all on the Asian mainland. They occupied China. So while it did severe civilian damage, horrible damage, it did not deter the military at all. And the response from Emperor Hirohito was to send 3 of these balloons. I shouldn't call them balloons. I should call them superdirigibles, which is what they were. And there's much I'm leaving out here, because he had also unleashed many Fugo balloon bombs, which were setting fires all over the Midwest, the purpose of which was to map the air currents of the United States so that he could facilitate these dirigibles going all over the United States and reaching every major city. This is how biological warfare could have completely leveled the United States, and the Americans knew it. But when he delivered these super dirigibles, they arrived 3 days after Pearl Harbor. I mean, what am I saying, Pearl Harbor? After Hiroshima, which was August 6th. And then I think it was August 6th. I know Nagasaki was August 9th. But he delivered, they arrived, and he sent them to Area 51, which was that Tonopah Army Airfield, now known as Area 51. It was where the Americans did their most advanced aeronautical research. And he knew this. And he landed, 2 of them arrived, 1 of them crashed in New Mexico. Not Roswell, but this was in 1945. Roswell doesn't happen until 1947. 1 of them crashed, and this has been cited as a UFO crash. It's not. It's a crash of a Japanese dirigible, which just crashed. And 2 of them arrived, and they had enough biological weapons to wipe out the entire United States, even the globe. And the Americans saw these. They had the tiny Japanese Yakuza were aboard, and the Americans took these, flew these biological weapons to Fort Detrick, and immediately saw that Emperor Hirohito was not fooling around. He could wipe out the United States. So Nagasaki happened. It wasn't too soon to stop that. And the Nagasaki was a bomb the Americans had created, a plutonium bomb, which had its own comedy of errors, if you can call it comedy, and how it was delivered and misdelivered and did minimal damage. We can't say it did no damage. It did minimal damage. But it was only after these dirigibles had landed and they saw their weapons and what the Japanese were capable of that the Americans agreed finally to keep on Emperor Hirohito as the emperor. So what happened after that was the show trials of Emperor Hirohito's military enemies, and he personally chose General MacArthur to be his go-to guy, because MacArthur was very well, acclimated with the Orient. He knew something about the Orient. He was also imperious himself. He acted like an emperor himself. And he said, this is somebody that I can manipulate. And he bribed MacArthur with all this gold. Emperor Hiro had, I think it was 13 or 24 tunnels of huge gold that he buried, because when he took over Asia, and he invaded Asia, he took all of the gold from all of the countries, ranging from Korea to Vietnam to Thailand. He raided all the countries. He took their gold and he buried it in 13 underwater tunnels. Some have access to the ground in the Philippines area. And this was, some of it ended up in the hands of President Marcos. So there's books written about all this gold. They don't know all of the inside story I'm telling you here, but MacArthur was being personally bribed by Hirohito. We do have evidence that's mentioned in the book of MacArthur accepting bribes from the Philippine president. So he was bribable for what would have been the equivalent of about $7 million today. I think it was 500,000 at the time. The general was for sale. He was definitely for sale. So this is exposed in the book. And he did what the emperor wanted, and so they say that, he reformed the Japanese government. There's no way he had the power or influence to do that. Mm-hmm. Japanese government changed, but the emperor still remained on as the emperor. And negotiations continued until 1951, when they agreed on the treaty. They signed the treaty in 1951 at the Presidio in San Francisco, and it went into effect on the emperor's birthday in 1952. So to get back to Roswell, is that these two dirigibles that were left after, hostilities were winding down, hadn't officially wound down, but they were winding down. The Americans kept the Yakuza as prisoners of war. They kept them as prisoners of war so the hostilities were still going on. And they tried to force the Yakuza to operate the craft because they wanted to use it for their own purpose, which I thought was a ludicrous purpose. And Douglas Dietrich, my co-author, agrees with me. They wanted to take at least one of these dirigibles and fly it down to Antarctica to subdue the Nazis, who had subdued the Nazis, the Third Reich in exile, who had flying craft. And the Admiral Byrd, the mission that was called Operation High Jump, that featured Admiral Byrd, was completely defeated, left early. They thought they were going to go down there and chase the Germans, the exiled Germans, out of Antarctica, but they could not do it. They were defeated. The story of that is in there. It's not gone into in extensive detail, but enough detail to get the idea of what's going on. And so the Americans said, well, we couldn't beat them that way. Let's use these dirigibles to go down there and bomb the Germans in Antarctica. So they were too big to get into the dirigibles themselves. So they were forcing and torturing the Yakuza to do this. Some of the Yakuza escaped in, I guess it would have probably been a test run in some of the flying craft that they had that were attachable to these dirigibles. They could sort of have them hanging down and lift them up, the aircraft. There were several small aircraft called, one of them was it was the design of the American Zimmer Skimmer. And they're shown in the book. The Japanese modified them, made them more efficient, but these were craft to go flying around. There's about, I don't know, 5 to 7 of these craft that the little Yakuza escape in. And they're flying over Yakima, Washington in June of 1947, just a few weeks before Roswell. And a pilot named Kenneth Arnold sees them. And these are the first, this is where the word flying saucer becomes coined as part of the lexicon of America and then the world, flying saucers. He saw these flying saucers. He was later forced to say that they were not what they were. They were, he had a picture of one and of some flying craft, but these were Japanese trying to escape the American. I don't know whatever became of them. I would have to ask Douglas that. But they had the other Yakuza flying one of these balloons, a whole team of them, and over the Four Corners, in what was a test flight. The winds blew. They ended up in the vicinity of Roswell, and they self-immolated. In other words, they burned themselves out because the Japanese in general, or many of them, were not afraid of committing suicide. And they were being so dishonored by the Americans that they thought death was better than to be tortured and in the employ of the Americans. So they blew themselves up over Roswell. Some of them survived. I don't know how many survived. It was 1 or 2 or whatever. And this was the Roswell crash. And the Americans knew what was going on. They immediately had cordoned it off. They operated too fast to know that it wasn't going on because they were the ones behind the operation in the first place. So they were able to respond very fast. And there's so many legends of the retractable metal. The dirigibles were made of what's called rubberized silk, something that Americans were not familiar with. So it bends back into its shape. There were hieroglyphs, which were basically the Yakuza's own, I guess what you call derivative of the Japanese language, that were basically notes and instructions for how to operate the craft. And all of this stuff is explained. The bodies of the aliens with the short coffins were indeed Japanese Yakuza. You can even read accounts of people saying, oh, I think they said they were Japanese or something. People saw that. The guy who ran the funeral home, who was asked for the short coffins, and of course when they went into rigor mortis, the bodies were described as orangish yellow. Some of them were burned where they were gray. They became gray with rigor mortis or grayish. So this whole myth of a gray alien. And then you have the guy who got the coffins for them. He became one of the curators of the Roswell Museum later, many years later. And there's so much more about what happened with that and the whole orchestration of a myth about Roswell to convince the people that aliens were controlling things and the government's trying to hide it out. And we have a program called Ancient Aliens that's been the most popular long-running TV show in cable history. 20 plus years of Ancient Aliens, and you don't see any aliens. You don't see any aliens. You see people thinking they're experiencing aliens. But what do you have? I mean, 20 years, it's like the aliens are here. The aliens are here. How long are you going to hear this before you begin to hear the truth about what's going on? And people are so indoctrinated, they'll say, oh, this is a government disinformation campaign to make us think that the Greys really didn't come to Roswell.
Peter, that is absolutely fascinating, and you have detailed this information in such a great manner. So whoever is even listening to this for the first time, you know that what's been told to you in your government approved history books in school, there's more to this reality than that. And I thank you for everything that you shared. So, that goes to my next question is Japan winning World War II, what effects does it have to this very day against what we perceive here in America or the global or foreign policy that we're dealing with today?
Well, it goes very much into modern times, and I'm just not going to go into the super modern times because I just don't have that much information on it. Douglas monitors that heavily.
Yes.
But the story of all of this is far more intriguing. But what I would say is Japan had a strangled economy in the 1930s, was being strangled off. And after the war, Japan began to thrive because all that Emperor Hirohito wanted to do was open the markets of the world, of the United States, to Japan. And it made his country boom. Now, he could have wiped out the United States, but he didn't want that. He wanted economics and markets. You don't wipe out a trading partner if you want to benefit from their trade. So you had the Japanese ultimately buying Rockefeller Center in the 1980s. You had the Japanese buying up everything. The Japanese economy has thrived to this day. It's a much better economy than the US economy. It's also it's a much older culture. It's a much more educated culture. It's just that Americans are very much like, if you could think of somebody from the country who knows farming, and the city folk would always come and take advantage of them in contracts because they just dealt in good, honest, down-to-earth life. But the city folk would be much more conniving because they were much more civilized, quote unquote civilized, and knew how things work. Well, the Japanese have been around thousands of years as an empire. America's been around 200 years. So the Americans are more like the hick culture compared to the Japanese. And they're very proud to show how much more advanced they are, but they're really not. And this goes into the technology of computer chips, the whole designing of mass production systems, which the Japanese have taught the Chinese. And Douglas was involved in a whole scenario because he was releasing, he had sent some of the materials that he had absconded with. He was able to get some of the Roswell metal. It was Roswell metal. It was because it was part of the superdirigible. And yes, this was a big thing that was sent to Art Bell, and there was a big thing about it. And it was, we have alien material here. We got parts of a flying saucer, and Linda Moulton Howe, and tested it and basically said it was Japanese aluminum. This was all in conjunction with a UFO museum that was opening up in Japan. It was an international publicity, and it was all shut down because when this was being exposed, they were going to have an exhibit for Roswell because the Japanese were interested in it because of the prisoners of war that took place at Roswell, with not only with the Yakuza, but with other Roswell prisoners. So this whole museum was kind of, event release became an international incident that was fostered and aggravated by my co-author, Douglas Dietrich. And what happened was Bill Clinton's administration was demanding the parts back because Bill Clinton was covering for everything that his predecessors had done. They wanted the parts back, and there was a big, I guess what you call diplomatic standoff between the Japanese and the Americans. And what the Japanese did to punish the Americans during the Clinton administration was to start investing in China. And this is how come China became a international monster, because the Japanese were basically feeding it and teaching it how to be a communist country, how to be a capitalist country. And the Japanese still pull many strings. There's many aspects we haven't gone into. I wouldn't say the Japanese are allies of the Chinese, but in certain respects they are, and they pull all the technological strings. They could probably really do serious damage to China if they really wanted to. I don't know all the ins and outs of that, though. So superior advanced culture. And there's many other aspects I don't have the time to go into here. They're touched on in past lectures on YouTube by Douglas Dietrich. Some of them, including myself, some of them not. So, but this is in essence the book, and I would encourage people to read it, because this is, if you want to get some idea of what's really gone on in the history of this world. If people in the National Archives, or the old building of the National Archives of the United States, it says study the past. Quote attributed to Buddha was, those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. So everybody going out and buying into the alien bandwagon, the way it is rendered on Ancient Aliens and shows of that ilk, movies like The Battle of Los Angeles, are basically buying into government propaganda. And there's no shortage of government propaganda. And we could go into a whole talk of the Office of War Information that evolved into the CIA. But that's basically what I have to share with you. If you have any other questions or comments, it's fine. But that's a good synopsis, a very detailed synopsis of the book. But there's much more in the book if you choose to read it. And I encourage you, because if you do read it and encourage others to read it, it will eventually result in more books on topics that are of equal importance. The book has been so suppressed that it's in the market, you can buy it, but there's so much noise that we need considerably more sales just to make the next book pay for itself, to make this one pay for itself. I'm not starving as an author or publisher, but I mean, I need the book to sell to be able to do the next book. It's you can't, just do it and put it out there and nothing happens. It doesn't work that way. So I encourage everybody to read it and to share it with others, share the information. And it'll get there. It takes time. Just please speed the process. You'll be happier if you do.
Thank you, Peter. And that's absolutely fascinating. And I do highly encourage everyone, please get the Roswell Deception and Demystification of World War II, because it is a life-changing book, and it will break this entire mystification that you have in this country about everything being based on World War II and the lies you get told about the war and ancient aliens and all of that stuff that Peter has beautifully explained in this lecture. And this goes to a few questions that I have, Peter. To those that are thinking, if Japan won the war, then the aspect of why is the U.S. military still stationed there, or the aspects of it, and them going to clean up aspects of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that it was the Americans that went in there and cleaned everything up.
That's correct. That's correct. The what the United States calls the occupation of Japan, the Japanese have another name for it, but it's basically the cleanup, or what do they call it? The restoration.
Yes.
They have another. I don't know what the name of. They have a different name for it, but basically, it was not the Japanese who were forced to clean up the radiation. It was the Americans who had to go in there and clean up the radiation. And of course, many of them, if not most of them, if not all of them, got cancer and died from the radiation. This is sort of a hidden secret that they don't really tell the vets about. You're gonna die exposed to radiation or be subject to sickness and illness. So it wasn't the Japanese who had to clean it up. I would also say that the Japanese didn't pay not 1 cent of reparations to the United States of America. Not 1 cent. They did pay reparations to certain nations where they bombed, maybe Thailand, places like that, Vietnam, maybe. But they didn't pay any reparations to the United States. And there's this thing, well, they've suffered enough. They've suffered enough. They don't, no. This is not. The Germans are still paying. Well, I think they might be done, but they paid extensive reparations to Israel, the Jewish people, which was to Israel. They paid reparations to all the countries they messed with. But this is a fact. Now, you also said, what else was it you said? You asked
the people that think that if Japan won the war, then why are Americans and Marines still stationed in Japan?
Well, they've often said that the Japanese have had a military ever since. They always did have a military. They said all the Japanese in their military. The Americans there basically are there to do, to protect the Japanese. They're not there to subdue them. They're there to protect them.
Understood. And it goes to my next question. Since this is a Black History Month in February, if you could briefly talk about the triple nickel unit, which is mentioned in the book.
The triple nickels unit was a unit of firefighters in the World War II, because the Japanese Fugo balloon bombs that I mentioned earlier were being set afire all over the United States, and they were creating firestorms. Firestorms is not a fire, but it's a massive fire, an out of control fire. And these the people that were selected to become the troopers, the stormtrooper or the fire that would come out of parachutes were black, and they were highly efficient, good firefighters, and they were assigned to do this. The reason they picked black people to do it, because this was a time of great segregation, and if the blacks were putting out the fires and monitoring the fires, they weren't going to be talking to white people. So this was going to stay in-house, so to speak. White people wouldn't know about the fires to the extent they were. This was in isolated regions of the United States, in the West, Midwest, West. And therefore, it could kind of the information could be conveniently suppressed. And the history of this has been suppressed as well, because they spelled it triple nickels, Nickles, instead of the way you would spell triple nickels. Now, triple nickels, it was called because it was 555 was the number of the unit, 555. So instead of calling it unit 555, they called it triple nickels, because triple 3 times 5, 3 fives, which is 5 cents is a nickel. So they spelled it Nickle rather than Nickel, because there was no internet then, and it would be hidden in the files. People would go looking for triple nickels, and they'd look for the way you should spell it, and they wouldn't find it, and there was just no information on it. So this was a way they would obfuscate things in the files. There was also, as part of these fire troopers, there was also a unit of black conscientious objectors, which they brought into this so-called unit, but they were different than the regular triple nickels. And they were conscientious objectors, because the black people a lot of them were conscientious objectors because it wasn't their fight. However, what they did with these people is they gave them parachutes where they wouldn't work. They were designed to kill them. And they would not only kill them, they would open in such a way so violently that it would break all their bones. So they'd have all their bones broken, and they'd be floating down still alive in misery and landing and just die. There's all sorts of people out there that were killed to this day. This is part of that the army was hiding. So this is some of the we're talking about Black History Month. This is something you're not going to see in Black History Month.
Definitely.
Much of what I write in my books, you won't see in Black History Month about people that are Moorish of descent or Black American Moors. You won't see it because we have everything about it is propaganda. It's not that everything that you read about in Black history didn't take place, but they don't tell you the good stuff. They just tell you what they want you to. It's all misdirection. That's all.
That's absolutely right, Peter. And I thank you dearly, my friend. I just have one last question for you. Is basically, when you look at Stanton Friedman and him being referred to as the father of Roswell, how exactly did he cover up the Roswell situation?
Well, Stanton Friedman is a very problematic character. We have a picture of him there with his eyebrows in the horn formation. It was part of the cult of the horned brow, which he was in the employ of I'll call him Dr. Michael Aquino, Colonel Michael Aquino, who was the he was the founder of the Temple of Set. He was a Satanist who began calling himself something else. I don't remember which, but he was diabolical. He was used for psychological operations in Vietnam. He was very good at it. And he was assigned to do the psychological operations of Roswell. And one of the people he picked was a fellow member of the cult of the horned brow, fellow member of the cult of the horned brow named Stanton Friedman. And Stanton Friedman was a nuclear physicist who had participated in experiments to basically irradiate America. That's in the book. And he ended up living in Canada because he wanted to stay away from the radiation. It also facilitated his son, who had problems that were evidently the result of the radiation problems that he had unleashed, or it was certainly divine karma. But Stanton Friedman was a very sinister figure, and he very heralded in the UFO community. He was there to announce the opening of the Roswell Museum. He was a big pusher of Roswell. He wrote a book called Crash at Corona, which was all cover up for another Japanese other dirigible. He was a very great misinformer, and I had crossed paths with him, and he showed himself to be very dishonest and disingenuous. But people can read about this in the book and who he was, and it's very common for people in the UFO field to attack each other. That's mainly what they're best at doing. And he was great at fostering a myth. And Roswell is a huge myth that is, as long as this book's been out, I heard when I did the Montauk project in 1992, released that, you felt the whispering of what was going on. You felt the whispering. It was, people were like, what's this? We'll find, and they get the information and they read it. It was filling a vacuum. Roswell fills a huge vacuum, but you don't hear the whispering campaign about it. People they're too busy, preoccupied with the COVID situation or whatever political issues are associated with it on either side of the coin. So this is, we live in a different environment, an environment that is less interested in the truth and more interested in their own faction and picking their own facts.
That's absolutely right, Peter. And I thank you dearly, my friend. And for those that are listening, if you needed the real disclosure, this book, The Roswell Deception and Demystification of World War II, is the exact disclosure that you need. It's being suppressed by the enemy. The truth is not being allowed to get out there. And everything our dear friend and brother Peter Moon has shared with us gives the details about this. So I highly encourage you all to go to Skybooks USA and please support this book. So any closing thoughts, Peter?
The only thing I would say is that disclosure was being heralded. Disclosure is here. June, July of last year, they were seeing disclosures coming. Tucker Carlson was promoting it. Disclosure, UFO disclosure. Well, you know what happened in disclosure? This book came out and all that talk stopped. You don't hear it anymore. So it's like, they were promoting BS. The disclosure was delivered. Of course, they don't want to point in this direction. And there's a certain cowardliness that is inherent in these people in the media, including the alternative media. The average citizen is really just in a position to learn and be informed. That's, they're usually not activists. But those who are being activists are, they cower away from this information. And I will say that it's foreign to most people, because most people in America are too American-centric. They have no idea of what's going on in the world, and they really don't want to know. And this doesn't apply just to the, I guess what you call the white faction. I don't want to call them white supremacist faction, but the white-oriented faction of the old values of America, because they're very American-centric. But it also applies to those on the left who are equally ignorant. So I would encourage people to become more learned in terms of other cultures and the world. And I invite people to get this book. You can get it on Amazon, Roswell Deception and the Demystification of World War II by Douglas Dietrich with Peter Moon. It's also available at skybooksusa.com. And it's a pretty interesting, very interesting read. It was fascinating to write this. And we'd like to do some more work on this topic and other topics. So thank you very much, Salman.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you again. And again, for all listening, please support this great work. Go to skybooksusa.com. And besides this book, also check out Peter's other works as well, which have also greatly and profoundly impacted me in my life. So thank you all again for listening and tuning in, and much love and much thanks to our friend Peter Moon as well. Thank you.